good evening, everyone. We're so glad that you could join us as we launch our conversation with Sarah Scoles. But before I introduce Sarah, let me take just a second to thank Megan Torrey and Abby Noyes at the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, the team at Global Santa Fe, and a special thanks to all of the World Affairs Councils across the country, as well as the Phoenix Committee and the Dallas Committee for Foreign Relations for helping to promote our programs. Really very much appreciated. When we started working on this program, we realized it was an important one to do because the euphoria really at the end of the Cold War, I think you all will agree, is a distant, fleeting memory. Russia, China, and the United States, they're all committed to really extensive nuclear modernization programs. Disarmament treaties that had been in place for a long time are either suspended or being canceled. And even worse, President Putin has been talking openly about moving tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. He may have already done it for all we know. So all of this makes this discussion timely and important. And I think it's why Sarah Scoles' book, Countdown: The Blinding Future of Nuclear Weapons, as well as another book that just was published by Annie Jacobson, Nuclear War, a Scenario, have received so much high praise and have been reviewed really across the world. Let me introduce Sarah Scoles. She is a good friend. She's become a good friend. We're both dog lovers and hikers. She's a science journalist, and she has written a number of articles that have been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Popular Science. In fact, I want to encourage all of you to go to her website, which is sarahscoles.com, where you can see links to many of her articles. One of the books that, it may have been her first book, which shows some of her fascination about UFOs. It was called Making Contact, Jill Tarter and the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. But Sarah, again, welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, nuclear weapons, very different from UFOs, but I'm sure we can find some overlap.
Just a while ago, we were talking about Jill Tarter, and you said that it was really quite interesting that she got interested in the hard sciences, especially at a time when women didn't do that. How did you get interested in becoming a science journalist?
Yeah, my interest also started with the hard sciences. I was actually really inspired by the movie Contact, which is kind of a fictional accounting of Jill Tarter's life, and the way that scientists search for extraterrestrial intelligence. But what really compelled me was that they used radio waves to look out at the universe. And I thought, oh, there's invisible waves zipping through the universe all the time that we can learn about, but I can't see. And so I became really interested in astronomy. But then I discovered writing in my last semester of college. And I thought, I'm not sure that I'm so interested in going super deep on a very narrow topic in the sciences. Maybe I can explore a lot of different topics by writing about them for people who might not otherwise encounter them. And so, yeah, I kind of departed my nascent scientific career in favor of writing about science. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
The timing of Countdown couldn't have been better. Did you know that Oppenheimer was going to be coming out about the time of the publication of your books, or was your publisher, Public Affairs, just especially wise?
I don't know if either of us can take credit. I think that as I was writing the book, I knew that the movie would be coming out because there were people filming while I was over at Los Alamos National Laboratory doing my reporting. So I thought, well, that's fortuitous, but I think probably it has something to do with, these issues and nuclear weapons kind of being in the zeitgeist and part of what the world is dealing with and what we're all thinking about. So, me and Christopher Nolan, we're on a wavelength, I think. So.
Very good.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as many of our viewers know, I moved to Santa Fe. I still have a foot in Dallas and a foot in Santa Fe, but coming here, I didn't have a total Rick Perry moment, but I really didn't know that the Department of Energy was as key as it is. And, I didn't understand about the national laboratories. I know we have a number of people who are watching tonight that live in this area and know about it, but I asked their patience because, Sarah, I'd really like you to explain about how the laboratories are structured and who has the contract and how all of that is done. And we'll show a picture of an organizational chart of the national laboratories as you're talking.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think a lot of people, probably most people, don't know that the Department of Energy oversees nuclear weapons in the arsenal that we have. And so the Department of Energy, as this map shows, has some laboratories that are run by the Office of Science that do more kind of basic research into physics, astronomy, electronics, those kinds of things. And then on the right in the blue, you see the 3 nuclear weapons laboratories that are run by this organization called the National Nuclear Security Administration. And it is in charge of maintaining, or as they say in the business, stewarding the nuclear weapons into the future. And each of these labs on the Office of Science side and on the weapons laboratory and NSA side they're overseen by the Department of Energy or the NNSA, but they are run by private contractors, nonprofits that each are in charge of one of the labs. And these nonprofits are usually some amalgamation of private companies that have come together to do this, or private companies and universities, or some combination of all that. So there's kind of a middleman between the government and what happens at the laboratories.
Well, elaborate on that a little bit more, especially for the Texans who may be watching. They may not know that Texas A&M is the key contractor right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Texas A&M, and I'm going to forget all of the private companies that are involved, but they come together, researchers with an interest in this, and their universities and private companies, often people who have worked in defense, especially on the National Nuclear Security Administration side, companies like Honeywell or Bechtel that have a long history in these kinds of things, join forces with the more academic side to run these big organizations.
In Los Alamos, I got my cheat sheet right here.
Okay, great.
Texas A&M and Triad National Security, and the
Mhm.
contract is extended through October, Halloween of 2028, and then Texas A&M, because I guess it's been renewed twice, it can't be renewed again, if I'm correct. But who is responsible when you really look at it, or said perhaps a different way, who are the key players in setting nuclear policy? Is it the Pentagon, the White House, or Department of Energy?
Yeah, I mean, on the operational side, it would be, the Pentagon. They're the ones who take the weapons into their possession and put them on missiles and actually, field them in the world. And so what happens there and what those delivery systems are like is their purview. The NNSA and the Department of Energy are in charge of the bombs themselves, but they are directed by Congress and often steered by the administration they're working under. Each administration that comes in will publish a nuclear posture review that kind of guides whatever happens in the next 4 years, or as the case may be, 8 years, for what happens. And there's also a nuclear weapons council that brings different groups together to do this. But in terms of the people at the labs, and the labs themselves don't really have a huge policy influence. They kind of create the technology a lot of the times, and then don't always have control of what happens after that.
You've started to answer a question that just came in from Ray Termini in Dallas, and I'll read his question in a second. But with your interviews that you had with people in the labs, I bet this came up quite a bit. And Ray's question is this: speaking of Oppenheimer, several scientists sought to influence government policy, but couldn't influence the decision on dropping the bomb. How influential are scientists now on government policy regarding nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I think the plight of scientists now is probably largely the same as it was after the Manhattan Project, where as our question asker, and thank you for the question, points out, they did try to influence how the bomb would be used, and then after World War II was over, how nuclear weapons development and strategy would go after that, and kind of didn't meet with a lot of success. And I think that is true now. There are a lot of scientists at the labs working on solutions to potential problems, like how do you enforce an arms control treaty? How do you tell if someone is, building weapons they promise not to be building? How do you tell if someone is doing a nuclear test they promise not to do? Come up with solutions, but don't often have a pathway really to getting those out into the world. And I talked to a historian named Audra Wolf, who said something that really stuck with me, which was that, nuclear weapon scientists, especially in the post-World War II era, have done a really good job of thinking through like the ethics and morals of what they're doing and wrestling with all that, and making peace or having a logic to what they're doing, but not always applying that same thing to their perception of their own political power. Like I think a lot of people have a misplaced perception that they do have kind of power over the use of what they're working on.
I think one thing that's interesting too is that you have the two main labs are Livermore, which is very close to San Francisco.
Mhm.
I think only like 25 or 30 minutes away. You have Los Alamos, which is 40, 45 minutes away from Santa Fe, really in a very rural area. How different are the cultures, and what work does each lab do that distinguishes itself?
Yeah, the cultures to me, at least from the outside, seem very different. Los Alamos, it's kind of geographically isolated, pretty rural. It's essentially a small town, kind of a company town. A lot or most, I'm not sure the exact percentage, people who live there work there or have some association with the lab, and it just feels kind of separate from the rest of the world, and everybody is very aware of the lab and what it does, and just kind of steeped in the nuclear world. And Livermore is, essentially just part of the Bay Area, of the East Bay of California. And so it exists inside the world in a way that Los Alamos does not exactly. And so there's people who live there who don't really know what the lab does. And there's other industries. There's wine and the wine industry, and there's and it wasn't founded, I think, for the purposes of building or designing nuclear weapons. And Los Alamos as a town was founded for that purpose. And so I think I'm forgetting the second half of the question. What was the second half of the
Well,
question?
just the culture. Yeah, I
Oh,
mean,
the culture. Yeah.
and it does Livermore have, in a sense, a business plan, a responsibility, a mission that's different than Los Alamos, or has the government said, let's put smart people in two different locations and let them compete and see what comes out?
Yeah, kind of a combination. That competition is key, though. Lawrence Livermore Lab was founded after World War II to kind of be a competitor to Los Alamos and to work on developing the the thermonuclear bomb, a stronger, more powerful bomb than had been developed during the Manhattan Project. And the Atomic Energy Commission at the time kind of thought, if we have these two labs with a bunch of smart people, fighting for resources, fighting for, figuring out the science, they will both come up with better ideas. And so it's still a little bit like that. Los Alamos historically is kind of the R&D laboratory, doing a lot of basic research and kind of almost academic and intellectual in the things that it pursues, and Livermore is similar, but has been involved in a lot of the design side. And so I think they see themselves really as the innovation lab. I actually think their tagline is "Innovation starts here," or something similar to that. So
And I want to encourage people to submit their questions. Don't let Mr. Termini be the only one tonight. So one of the things that is happening here in Los Alamos is they have been hiring like mad. How many people work there now, and why are they hiring on at this incredible level to the point where there's not even an inventory of homes for people?
Right. Yeah, they're working on hiring. They will have hired 2,500 new people for a new mission that they are undertaking right now. And actually, do you have the most recent employment number? I think mine might be slightly outdated.
Yeah, it's about 15,000.
15,000. Okay. Yeah, that's about right. And so, yeah, hiring 2,500
Oh, no,
new
excuse me.
people.
Now it's 18,000. Yep.
18,000. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, that probably includes some of
And
the,
if I'm wrong, I bet someone will correct me.
yeah, we could definitely, that's what you get for having a smart audience. But yeah,
That's
so
right.
hiring 2,500 new people, especially in a small town that is it's on mesas, and so there's only so many places that you could build, has presented a big problem. There's the one major road in, traffic is a problem, and so it's kind of a little bit of a nuclear boom town right now in a way that hasn't been true, and I think is causing some growing pains for the town itself.
Yeah, the current director of the lab said that the most dangerous thing at the lab is for people driving in and out. Clearly, I hope he was being, well, I don't want him to be facetious, but he was making light of some of the safety issues that have been brought up that we'll get to in a few minutes. Are the people who work at the lab, are they civil servants, or is it handled differently?
For the most part, they work for that middleman corporation that we're talking for. So they're not directly employed by the government. The DOE and the National Nuclear Security Administration do have employees who would be, of the government itself and civil servants, but most people work for Triad National Security, and separately.
A quick question from Bruce McEver. What does Oak Ridge do these days?
I'm not familiar with all of their programs, but I know that they do a lot of work with isotopes. So these are versions of atoms that kind of have the same number of protons and electrons, but different numbers of neutrons. And so they do production and research on those and supply them to places like the medical industry or whoever else might need them. And that goes back a long way in their history. They also have been doing a lot of very impressive supercomputing work. I think that they had the first, or at least one of the first, approaching exascale supercomputers, and they run simulations for doing basic science research, whether that's on, climate and weather modeling and things like that, or let's see what else, or dealing with astronomy, things like that. So.
Well, one of the things too that I'd like you to elaborate on a bit is after the demise, the breakup of the Soviet Union, in a sense, didn't the laboratories have to perhaps justify their existence and their budgets in a different way than they are today? And so what else, we don't have time to talk about every lab, but what else does Los Alamos do that is perhaps not related to nuclear weapons?
Right, yeah. And after the Cold War ended and there was less of a focus on nuclear weapons and more of a focus on, getting rid of some of them and backing down from things, they did have to find a reason to exist. And so they did diversify what they were up to. I mean, Los Alamos does, let's see, they do kind of basic computing research for one, to figure out, how do you make a computer better, faster, more resistant to radiation, things like that. They have they even have a biology side. They do kind of pandemic prediction and modeling even before we all lived in a pandemic. Like, how do you model the spread of disease? How do you control the spread of disease? They do climate work, and a lot, and especially a lot of the people I talk to do basic astronomy work. How did the elements form after the Big Bang? How did we end up with the universe that we have now? Or even, how do we roll a rover around Mars? So sort of, you name it, Los Alamos probably does a little bit of it.
I will say that one of my neighbors works at the lab. He's worked there for quite a long time, and it seems that his weather forecast is much more accurate than anything else I get. So clearly they're doing some work in weather forecasting. Let's go back to your book for a moment about one of the things, folks, I want you to know is that she's really done just an interesting job of tracing the careers of people who work at the lab, their education, what motivated them, their successes, their frustrations. I'm wondering, did the lab give you a blank check to go talk to people? Did you have to say what type of person you wanted to meet with? How much control and oversight did they have? And what freedom did people have to really talk with you?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, I like to think I had some freedom, but I mean, the truth is the lab was never going to let me talk to anyone they didn't want me to talk to, and I probably wouldn't even know those people existed. So with that caveat, I'd been writing for a number of years about nuclear topics and the work at Los Alamos and the other labs. And so I kind of had a stable of people who I knew mostly from their scientific work, who I knew also worked on nuclear weapons. And so I kind of started with them, I would say, I wrote about your black hole research 3 years ago, and, I did a good job with that. I didn't, screw it up horribly.
Yeah.
Can I talk to you now about what you actually spend your time doing? So I started with those, and then I did put in requests like, can I talk to someone, who knows a lot about the explosives you're using, or can I talk to someone who knows a lot
Was
about
any request ever denied?
No, no.
Okay.
I think, Los Alamos, maybe more than the other labs. I did have more trouble with the other labs. I think Los Alamos was the freest with things. Kind of prides itself on that kind of academic culture and academic freedom of letting people say what they want. So, I did have a chaperone in every interview, someone watching what I
A
was saying.
minder, huh?
A minder, yes.
What has the response been to the book? You've gotten great reviews in The Economist and New York Times, Wall Street Journal, but what has been the response from people who are connected with the lab versus people who, like me, who are just learning about it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone connected with the lab would necessarily tell me their negative thoughts, but I have heard mostly like, we don't get to talk about our work that often. And so it was cool to have the opportunity to share that. And I think you captured it, mostly is what I've heard. But interestingly, from the outside, from people who are maybe coming to the book, not working at the labs, I kind of get a mix of people thinking it's very anti-nuclear, people thinking it's very pro-nuclear, which in journalism, they say if you're upsetting people on both sides, then you've probably done it right. And so I'll take that, I guess.
We have a number of questions coming in now, and some of them relate to the modernization plans.
Sure.
And one of them says, how this is from Jonah Gosney with the Connecticut World Affairs Council. Jonah, thanks so much. How has the changing technology of nuclear weapons we field affected their role in U.S. strategy? I think that's related to a degree to modernization. And then, are we able to keep up with China? So let's talk about the modernization program and tell us what is the budget, what's the purpose, and then we're going to roll into a little discussion of plutonium pits and let you explain a diagram.
Okay, great. Yeah, the modernization program, it involves upgrading or updating the weapons themselves, and then also the delivery systems, the missiles and things that the Pentagon is in charge of. And it is depends on who you ask and on what day, but probably close to $2 trillion over the course of 30 years. And so it involves things like replacing the explosives that are inside the weapons with more modern, safer ones, upgrading things like electronics. You made a face at safer.
Yeah, when you said
explosives.
safety, I mean, what makes a weapon not safe?
Yeah. Well, the conventional explosives that used to be in there were more sensitive to things like, being dropped or set on fire or something. And they were, obviously we haven't had an accident, so they were safe enough. But the ones they're putting in now are insensitive high explosives, which are highly resistant to things like temperature changes or being dropped or, falling out of a plane by accident or things like that. So then there's also things like, electronics and electrical upgrades. And then I think the things that kind of might affect strategy, to answer the question in a way that I don't know if we know the answer to yet, are some things that do make some of the weapons more targetable so that you can send them to a very particular place very reliably, which allows them to have a lower yield, because if you can be more precise about where, hopefully we're never sending them anywhere at all, but if you know something is going to reliably go where you want it to go, it can be less. And so Sorry, go ahead.
No, no. Well, I was just going to say, I mean, that's one of the questions that we have here again from Mr. Termini. He's not the only questioner now, but are our weapons old and are we testing them? And that gets in this whole thing that you and I have talked about a lot, that ever since what, 1992, we've not been able to do live testing, thanks to, I mean, George H.W. Bush put that forward, and there's not been tests in the United States. We know North Korea has tested, and we can come back to that, but I know you've thought and talked to people about, do we need to do, I mean, the people lab, are they proposing that we do live testing, or are they comfortable with the simulations and the subcritical tests that we are able to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the weapons we have are old. They're decades old, and that's part of why we're doing this modernization program, is in some cases to give them different capabilities, but in a lot of cases just to make sure that they work as intended. And then, as part of that, since we can't test them to find out, would they work as intended, and as we change them, are they going to continue to work the same way? We have to rely on exactly what you mentioned, these simulations and smaller scale tests instead of testing the whole thing. And I think at the lab, no one I spoke to was in favor of returning to testing. And, they're the ones building the simulations. They're the ones doing the experiments. And I think, partly because of that, that's their whole professional lives, is kind of making this good enough that we won't have to test. And I think the question probably comes up more on the Department of Defense side, because the Department of Defense is also involved in this certification process that happens, that has to happen annually to say, are the weapons safe? Will they work as intended? And if military leaders have doubts that, scientists at the lab do not, to connect back to the question earlier, I think probably it's more likely that the Department of Defense uncertainty would win out over the scientists' certainty.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So Beckett Potter, a young man from Dallas, says, is China at an advantage, not only by their technological advantages? I don't know if see what you say about that. Do they have a technological advantage? But also by their sheer number of factories and people to be a major nuclear power.
Yeah, I mean, China has a much shorter history with nuclear weapons than we do, and a much smaller arsenal than we do. I think the last time I looked, I don't want to get this number wrong, but I think it was in the hundreds rather than the thousands that we have had. And so I think, the United States has kind of a running start from that perspective, and a very robust program to understand how they work, how to make them work better, how to make them be safer. And I think that kind of deep and long expertise does give us an advantage, at least for a while. But as you point out, they have a lot of people, they have a lot of very smart people, and China is able to mobilize resources in a way that the United States just is not as quickly. So I think that would be the question for me. But I mean, to be honest, it's very difficult, especially in an unclassified sphere, which I live in, to really know what's going on. So I don't know that I know the answer fully.
Let's go ahead and put up on the screen the diagram where you explain what a plutonium pit is.
Sure.
And that is such a key part of the modernization program at Los Alamos, as well as its Savannah Flats, right?
Savannah River.
Savannah River. But enormous amount of money is being spent on this, and there's questions about the safety. So take a minute and just, what are we looking at, Sarah?
Right. Yeah, we're looking at a crude diagram of a nuclear weapon, and kind of toward the center is this thing called the plutonium pit, which is in almost all modern weapons, and it's this kind of hollow sphere of plutonium, which in this, it's a metal, and so it kind of looks like a dull silver bowling ball. And it is surrounded by, there we go, conventional explosives, just, regular things that explode. And at the beginning of a nuclear weapon detonation, those explosives would go off, and that would kind of squish all of the plutonium together. which would cause it to go into its critical chain reaction and start fission. So start splitting apart, releasing radiation, and continuing that reaction. And in modern weapons, that reaction and the environment that creates sets off a fusion part of the bomb and the secondary part of the bomb, which you can see in this diagram also. And so it's the trigger for the whole thing. It's what makes a nuclear weapon to start with.
And 1.75 billion has been allocated for pit modernization. And so I guess my question here is the plutonium pits that we've had, these cores, why do we need to, are we making new ones? Are we worried about the degradation, or what's the motivation behind doing this?
Yeah, so plutonium is a very strange element. A lot of the scientists I talk to think that it is the strangest element, period. It has 6 different states that it can be in a solid state, and so it's very unstable, you know. And so when you build a pit out of it, it's constantly also irradiating itself. You know, its point its point is that it's radioactive, so it's creating other elements. It's shooting those atoms and that energy throughout the pit, and it creates these things that the scientists call voids and defects. And so as one of the scientists put it to me, you know, would you build a bridge out of plutonium and then drive across it 40 years later? And I probably wouldn't, but I think, you know, the scientists have done a lot of studies on how plutonium ages and whether all of that stuff actually causes any problems with them. And so far, the studies indicate, at least the ones that are public and unclassified, not exactly. You know, it should last for a good while longer. But the scientists are also worried about what they call nonlinear effects, which are, you know, things you can't predict that happen all of a sudden, and that plutonium behaves in a nonlinear way. And so we need to restart this capability before any of those things become a problem. Because if we start after they become a problem, then we have, you know, thousands of problematic pits spread across the world. But the argument against it is that most of our science so far does indicate that they are stable right now. There's no problems, and we are putting them in new weapons or newly designed or upgraded weapons instead of just replacing the ones in old weapons first. And so that calls into question the true motivation of the program. But it's a highly classified topic, and so really from the outside it can be really hard, especially if you're not a journalist who could just go ask people a bunch of questions to even be able to form an opinion on it, really.
Abby, if you would show the picture of what a glove box looks like, and then Sarah, you know, what type of training does someone have who does this type of work?
Yeah, a very long and intense training. So this shows someone working with a glove box. I think this is at Los Alamos. And so this is a piece of machinery that kind of protects them from the radiation of whatever is inside, whether that's plutonium or something else. And so they're only kind of remotely handling it. And so, you know, Los Alamos at least has actually changed their training right now to be very education focused for all the people they're bringing on. And so they can go to essentially like a plutonium academy to learn, you know, not just like, you know, don't put this piece of plutonium metal next to this piece of plutonium metal, but why, like the science of why, so that it makes more sense. But I know that at Savannah River, where they have less of a history of working with plutonium in this particular way, I think it takes 5 years for someone to go from training to actually working on the pit. So that's what they anticipate. So it's a huge lift. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've read lots of articles in the Santa Fe New Mexican or articles in science magazines, really pros and cons about the safety record. And, you know, as a journalist and someone who I know looks at this in a very critical, balanced way, how do you feel about the safety record at Los Alamos or some of the other labs?
Los Alamos is definitely the one whose safety record I've looked at most. And so I think, they have had a number of breaches recently of the glove boxes where something has gone wrong with the glove box or the way someone is using it, and there has been contamination on them. No one has died. There have been, as far as I know, no very serious injuries, but it does seem like similar kinds of accidents continue to happen. And, part of that, I think, is that they have been working on updating the building where they're going to be building all of these pits, and updating things like the glove boxes, and getting all of the right procedures in place for all these new people they're bringing on. And so I think, it could definitely be better. And I think anytime you're working with something like plutonium for the sake of the public and the sake of the people who signed on to work there, we should learn from our mistakes, and not continue to make the same kinds of ones. At the same time, I think, it's a dangerous job, it's a dangerous substance, and there probably always will be some kinds of accidents. I think that's probably unavoidable.
And I don't want to minimize any of the accidents, but I read that, if someone takes a swab home and puts it accidentally in a pocket, and then notifies the lab that they made that mistake, that goes down as a violation.
Right.
You don't want any of those, but you have to look at each one. We're hearing from Irene. Sorry, Irene, I don't know where you're from, but let me read your question. She recently heard Sig Hecker, someone Sarah and I know well. Dr. Hecker is director emeritus of the lab and also teaches nuclear practice at Texas A&M in College Station, and also the Monterey Institute. Irene says, Dr. Hecker says that we cannot manage climate change without using nuclear energy. Do you happen to agree with him?
It's a strong statement. I don't know that I would say that I agree that it's true that we can't. On the other hand, I do think, it is one of the sources of energy that, there's a lot of bang for the buck there. It doesn't take very much nuclear material to create a lot of energy in a much more efficient way than things like solar and wind. And so, I think it's a very expedient solution. I do have my own concerns about some of it. Anytime, as we were just talking about with accidents, like anything dangerous, there are always going to be accidents. And so, I like a lot of oversight and transparency, also being a journalist. And so, but I think, a lot of the cultural fear that we have that keeps some of the development under wraps is probably not helping our battle with climate change.
Parker Tracy says and asks, the National Nuclear Security Administration is 80% contractors and 20% from the federal workforce. You'll have to tell me if those numbers are right. But
that sounds about right, yeah.
This seems to be very unique. What issues are the industry facing around workforce development, especially recruiting younger folks and retaining institutional knowledge as the boomers retire? And in your book, Countdown, you address this, developed it quite well.
Yeah, the NNSA is in a pretty tough spot. If I remember the numbers correctly, I think it was 40% of their workforce was eligible to retire in 5 years, a couple of years ago, which is a lot. And, those are the people who still had experience with things like nuclear testing in some cases, or with weapons development in a way that we haven't done in a while. And things like working with plutonium in a way that, at the same time that we're trying to ramp all of these sorts of programs up, aside from testing, a lot of the expertise is leaving the institution. And I think at the same time, it has been hard to recruit people because, in a place like Livermore, California, people can go get tech jobs. If you could work at a supercomputer for Livermore, or you could go work for Google, like Google's definitely going to pay you more, and things like that. And so I think creating the right incentives to get young people, or in the case of Los Alamos, how do you convince young people to move to a small town with not enough housing, and the housing that's there they can't afford? And so I think that is something that the labs are still trying to figure out. But At the moment, a lot of the recruiting comes through looking at science graduate students often who have some kind of expertise that's adjacent to nuclear weapons, whether that's in chemistry or physics, and saying like, hey, we'll pay for your graduate school, we'll pay for your fellowship afterwards if you will come, here and learn about some of the work that we do, and you can keep doing some of your research, but we also want you to learn about our research. And I think that works pretty well. A lot of the people who have those fellowships do end up going on to work for the labs.
Now, I know the lab has really good internship programs and programs for postdocs. And this is a related question, excuse me, from Jonah. How does the United States preeminence in higher education institutions, especially research universities, how does that affect our nuclear research? Because it seems that would give us an advantage over, say, Russia or China, at least at this point in time.
Yeah, I think that it does. I mean, we have many of the best, physics researchers and engineering researchers, which are probably the two disciplines most relevant to what we're talking about, are here. People get educated in those programs. And then I think a lot of very smart people go to work at the national labs. And I think that is to our advantage. And so much of the work that goes on at the labs is classified that we are mostly taking, American graduate students to go on and do that work. There's not really very many opportunities for people from most countries to go work for the labs at all.
Nikki McQuiston poses this question: how much of the renewed focus on security defense and the US and Russia stockpiling of nuclear weapons has been accelerated by Ukraine? And now we also have the Hamas-Israel crisis, and why Israel does not say that they are a nuclear power. I think it is pretty much assumed that they do have nuclear capability.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think most of the modernization programs that are in place, including plutonium pit production and the design of a new weapon, were in place before the Russian invasion took place. But I think that probably that and the Israel-Hamas conflict have cemented the place of nuclear weapons in American strategy. They are in the background of every conversation that we have about these conflicts and about how we respond and how others are responding. And so I don't think that there is a chance of these programs being canceled or scaled back. I think it has cemented their importance to American strategy. And I think, people probably have opinions on both sides of that. Like, that's bad, that's causing an arms race, or that's keeping us secure from these conflicts.
Well, remember, after the end of the Cold War, Ukraine had a large percentage of Soviet Union's weapons, and I can't help but think if Ukraine had not given up those weapons to Russia, Ukraine would have had deterrence against this invasion.
Right, which does make things like, non-proliferation complicated, because that's true. If there were one more nuclear nation on Earth and it were Ukraine, things might go down very differently. But on the other hand, we encourage, nations to not develop nuclear weapons. And so I think it's very complicated when you're one of the states that does not have the advantage of having nuclear weapons.
So Bruce asks, how many nations now have nuclear weapons? And go ahead.
Oh, there are 9 right now.
9. And that does not include Israel, right? Or does that include Israel?
I think that does include Israel.
Okay.
I have to double check, but I think it does.
And then a number I saw, and I can't remember, and perhaps you do, is how many countries nuclear weapons are located in how many countries?
I don't actually know if I know the answer to that question.
I think don't hold me to this, viewers, but I think it was like 17 or 19.
Okay. Yeah.
That where nuclear weapons have been staged. Bruce also asks, are you familiar with Sam Nunn's work at Georgia Tech? And what is he doing now? I'm not. You?
No, I'm not. I'm familiar with his work, after the Soviet Union collapsed and trying to get a handle on the loose nuclear things going on then, but I'm not familiar with what he's doing now.
And then talk with us about some of the new weapons that are coming online. One of our viewers asks, is the U.S. researching better weapons than we have now? cleaner, more deadly, perhaps more targeted
Mhm.
than what we have today.
Yeah. Most of the specific capabilities are classified, so they don't talk to me about them, but we do know that things are some weapons are more targeted. And you know that there is a new weapon design that we're working on right now called the W93, which is the first new weapon we've designed since the end of the Cold War. So it's been decades since we made a new one, and presumably, you know, we will take advantage of it being the modern era to make it better in some way, but I don't personally know exactly what ways. I think you know, most of the updates that I have heard about do aim to get to this philosophy that they call it the labs always never. You know, the weapons always go off when we want them to, as we expect them to, and never go off when we don't want them to. And so just keep making sure they are as reliable as possible, which in my opinion at least is better. I don't want them to go off when they're not supposed to. So that involves things like the new kinds of explosives that are less sensitive to things like accidents.
Have you done much research, or I suppose you've thought about this, but what we're seeing in outer space, and you know, the fact that there's essentially at this point no significant global treaty on how to handle that.
In terms of putting nuclear weapons in
Yeah,
space.
yes.
The Outer Space Treaty does prohibit weapons of mass destruction in space, but I mean, anyone can leave a treaty anytime they want, really. And so if you know, I'm sure a lot of the viewers are familiar with Russia's statements or our statements about Russia that they are developing a satellite that can carry a nuclear weapon and use it in space. And I think the thing to be worried about from there, you know, a lot of people when they first hear about that are worried about it deploying from space to somewhere on Earth. But I think the intent is to use it in space against satellites, which is, you know, it's not really radiation falling down on us exactly in a dangerous way, but our whole world relies on satellites, you know. The electrical grid, GPS, banking systems, pretty much everything. And you know, our missile warning satellites are up there also. And so I think, you know, that could be as devastating as a nuclear weapon detonated on Earth. And so I think it's definitely worrisome, for sure.
And a question from Greg Vucic from Albuquerque, who happens to be president of the World Affairs Council of Albuquerque. Could you please comment, Sarah, on the strategic pluses and especially minuses of an ICBM force versus submarine and aircraft-based weapons? Essentially, is the Triad still what we need?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have called into question whether we still need the ICBMs, you know, the weapons that are located on subs and in planes can get more places faster, really, or get anywhere we need them to go. And a lot of people, I think, see the ICBMs almost as like a sitting duck or a waste of money. You know, they would be one of the first things targeted if someone else was going to try to attack us. And so it's almost like asking for that. Not asking for that exactly, but I have heard someone call them like a sacrifice waiting to happen, and that they don't provide anything to the triad that the other two legs can't handle on their own. Clearly, people in charge of policy disagree because the ICBMs are still here. So I don't think that's likely to change anytime soon. They're undergoing their own modernization program for the missiles that are there. So clearly they see some
I
strategic
don't want to be
advantage.
cynical, but there are a lot of dollars from defense companies that are
There are, and there's a lot of states involved, a lot of states that are getting, you know, money
sure.
for that also, which
Greg, and Greg, I apologize if I mispronounce your last name, Greg Gosick. Good question. What are the lab surveillance systems for monitoring staff to prevent espionage? And have there been any significant breaches in the 21st century?
You know, I think that is probably one of the things that, or it's definitely one of the things they have not talked to me much about. I know in terms of taking actual, nuclear material, there's a lot of surveillance systems like you were mentioning earlier, Jim. If you took a swab home, that would be a huge security breach, but also anytime you go from room to room in a place where there is nuclear or radiological material, you are scanned by things that would pick that up. In terms of more like intellectual or document-based espionage, I don't know the specific measures that they're taken, but I do know that employees get a large amount of training in what to watch for if someone is trying to get information from them. Hopefully they have robust systems in place to prevent that from happening. The only major espionage scandal that I know about was a case with a man named Wen Ho Lee, who was Chinese by ethnicity, and he was accused of spying for China, and then it ended up, not really being a case. It's very possible that there are cases that I don't know about or that have been kept under wraps, but if anyone hears about them, I'd be interested myself to know.
Well, from what I've learned by talking to people who work at the lab, it seems to be more closed, more secretive than any other government facility, including the CIA and other intelligence agencies, from what I've seen. Robert Larrick asked this question: why did China allow nuclear North Korea? No real pressure against. Let me just suggest, Robert, that you pick up Sig Hecker's book, Hinge Points, remarkable book about his extensive experience going to North Korea, I think 7 times over 6 years, or 6 times over 7 years. And he really addresses that. But Sarah, you may want to add.
Well, I'm curious what Sig thinks before. What's your summary of his stance on it?
Sig really, his thesis is on this, is that North Korea was looking for legitimacy, very worried about regime change, and that there's been significant opportunities on both sides. Let me be clear, both sides, where there might have been a way to reduce or even disarm North Korea. Regarding China had, and I always thought this too, that China had a lot more influence than Sig thinks it does, and especially now it has very limited experience. But I don't want to get over my skis or over your skis. Go talk to, just put in your browser Sig Hecker North Korea, and you'll see some really good arguments on and discussion on this. This is probably perhaps too personal for you, but what is your opinion of the U.S. dropping nuclear bombs on Japan, especially the second bomb? I'm sure you've thought about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very complicated thing, especially in hindsight. I think I will say that I kind of like the idea that some of the Manhattan Project scientists had at the time, which was to invite Japanese leaders to come watch a demonstration of what the bomb could do and say, this is what we could do and will do if you don't, do what we want. This is the power that we have before using it on people. So.
And there's another good book just on that by Evan Thomas, Road to Surrender, that came out. Bruce McGever says, who's working to reduce the number of nuclear weapons? And are there active programs on this? And I think, tell people, if you would, about like New Mexico Nuclear Watch, where Jay Coughlin works, or in other organizations. Both.
Yeah, New Mexico in particular has a number of nuclear watchdog groups, like Nuclear Watch New Mexico, the Southwest Research Institute, I think Concerned Citizens for Our Nuclear something, but a number of groups that they're very good at getting documents and information and analysis and informing people about things that it's really hard to be informed about, and saying, we don't agree with how these programs are going. We want there to be fewer weapons, less contamination, and here's how it is right now. And I think, that's a valuable public service. People have a lot of different opinions about how the watchdog organizations function, but I think that they bring a lot of information to light that otherwise would not be there. And I think, you know, there's an organization called Global Zero that has a lot of smart people, some sort of powerful people, and was spurred on by powerful politicians of the past. The Global Zero movement, which is the movement to abolish nuclear weapons entirely. And so this is an organization that I think is well respected and kind of has a very step-by-step program for how we could reduce our reliance on nuclear weapons for strategy and then eventually eliminate them, which I think is valuable, because a lot of times people say, you know, how we're never going to give up our nuclear weapons. This is what the balance of world power rests on. But here's a plan for how we could maintain that balance of power while still going this direction. So they're a group to check out for sure.
I looked at my phone. I didn't want people to think I'm not paying attention. What I looked up was Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists.
Oh, yes.
And I've been a subscriber now for about 6 months, and you get almost a daily newsletter, and they pick up significant pieces in newspapers and some journals on all sides of nuclear weapons. And in fact, George Will wrote an interesting piece today in the Washington Post. Some of you may have read, saying that, you know, perhaps we're paying too much attention to climate change, which he was sharply criticized for writing that, but saying that we're not paying enough attention to the threat from our adversaries regarding nuclear weapons. I wonder if there's any other organizations like that there where people can get really good email newsletters.
Yeah, there's the Federation of American Scientists. I think they maybe focus less on nuclear weapons specifically than they used to, but they were kind of, both them and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists were founded by some of the Manhattan Project scientists who kind of changed their minds about what they were doing. Or wanted to have their own sort of watchdog over what it was. So there's a lot of very interesting documents, and I think it's FAS.org for the Federation of American Scientists.
Let me roll these two questions together from Irene and Albert Plunkett. And Albert's asked about the Chinese investment in their nuclear forces. Can the U.S. counter two aggressive nuclear powers who could mount a combined attack? How serious is the Chinese arsenal? I think you've addressed that, but and Irene says, you know, Putin's strategy really has changed too. I mean, nearly every day you're hearing Putin or one of his people talk about the perhaps using nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I mean, given the number of nuclear weapons that we have, granted, you know, Russia and China together might have or eventually have more weapons than we have, but we still have enough weapons to, I think, deter that, hopefully, and to counter that. Like, you only need so many weapons to get whatever job you're trying to do done, and it doesn't matter if there's two countries with, you know, 5,000 weapons or 10,000 weapons or things like that. Like, nuclear weapons are very powerful, and you don't need an overwhelming advantage to be able to accomplish that.
Well, The Economist doesn't often, well, Economist does, you know, 2 or 3 book reviews a week, but they're very, very selective. And the fact that they selected your book says a lot. As I think people can tell, I enjoyed it and learned a lot. And I want to thank you so much, Sarah, for being with us. And do go to Sarah's website. That's sarahscoles.com to see some of her great writing. And let me remind you that our next World Now program, unless something happens in between, will be on June 20th. We'll be talking with Stephen Harmon. He is the author of a book coming out in June called Behind the White House Curtain. It's really interesting about what it's been like for a VOA correspondent to be covering the White House for a few decades. So I hope you'll join us for that. And always looking for suggestions. Don't hesitate to email us. And thanks so much for joining us. And we'll see you next time on World Now with Jim Falk, hosted by the World Affairs Council of Connecticut and Global Santa Fe. Have a great evening.